Alright everybody, welcome back to another Magic live stream from Lost Legion Games and Comics in south of Charleston, West Virginia. My name, as always, is Zachary Evans, but not as always is the format that we're streaming for you this week. That, of course, Wednesday Night Modern, which is our second broadcast of this format in the last month. I cannot guarantee that we will continue due to relatively poor turnout tonight, but we are here, the equipment is set up, so let's watch some Eternal Magic. So on the left, we've got stream regular Garrett Meadows, and he's playing a very interesting homebrew tonight, which should be fun to watch. It is a green-black zombies deck featuring Birthing Pod, so trying to live the dream, potting away Charles Messengers to both do damage and then go get Skinrenders with the high end of Mikaeus the Unhallowed. So not unlike the green-black standard deck from its time when Birthing Pod was legal, but with obviously some higher power cards thanks to the availability of the modern card pool. So, and his opponent is Troy King, who is playing green-white Hate Bears, basically all the usual suspects: Even Mind Sensors, Loxodon Smiters, Thalia, as well as Stirring Wildwoods and Aether Vial to cheat them all into play. So a battle between a aggro combo deck and just an aggro control deck, so it should be interesting to watch. Already resolved, we've got Garrett with a turn 1 Gravecrawler into a turn 2 Deathrite Shaman, and Troy starting off with a Noble Hierarch, and then playing obviously a drawn Aether Vial on turn 2 here. So while the Hate Bears deck is not what I would call a incredibly popular archetype, it is definitely on the radar as far as the modern gauntlet goes, but Garrett's deck, obviously, something of his own creation. So here we see him play a third land and eat fetch land with his Deathrite Shaman to cast a Skinrender, Scars of Mirrodin block, limited all-star Skinrender, the Master of Value. So it comes into play, puts 3 -1/-1 counters on a card. That's going to be the Noble Hierarch, and I guess in response we're going to, I don't know if he can flash anything in at this point. He's just going to path the Skinrender at end of turn, I guess. So Skinrender, obviously not necessarily the powerhouses that you expect in a format with Tarmogoyf and Bob and whatnot, but definitely the kind of target that you want to pod into on 4 and pod away to get your 5. As Troy plays a Stirring Wildwood, which is actually one of the more versatile man lands. It's easy to activate at only 3 mana, and then does have a 4 toughness, so it's out of bolt range. Often goes under the radar a little bit. Question in the chat about where you can find deck lists. Well, I don't have deck lists currently, but I will try to get those after the fact. Make sure to follow us on our various forms of social media. Username ZachSellsMagic on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And I'll see about posting those deck lists later on in the week. So Garrett serving in with his Gravecrawler, then plays a Geralf's Messenger. So a total 4-point life loss for Troy this turn. Troy takes his Vial up to 2 here, but he's quickly falling behind. Then Geralf's Messenger. If you're familiar with playing this deck, either the blue-black version or the red-black version that were popular at the time, that these cards were standard legal, this Zombies deck plays a lot like a burn deck, with the Blood Artists, with Geralf Messengers, and can do a lot of direct damage through life loss at the end point. So 10 points of life, not necessarily safe against this board state out of Garrett. Another question in the chat of whether or not there's merfolk in the field tonight. There is not. The merfolk guy is not around tonight. Not many players are around tonight, just 6 of us. But we've got some real decks out there, so we should be able to bring you 3 rounds of good modern coverage. So Troy passes back with 4 mana up and an Aether Vial on 2, so he's representing at the minimum a Stirring Wildwood activation, and certainly he has a 2-drop he can slide into play through his Aether Vial. A card like Thalia really good in this spot too, as it can trade with the front half of that Geralf's Messenger without dying itself, though it does make it a much bigger threat after the fact. So Garrett serves in with the Gravecrawler and the Messenger, and now Troy is deciding how he wants to respond. He's going to flash in an Aven Mind Sensor and block the Geralf's Messenger. It's going to take a total of 4 damage, though, as the Geralf's Messenger triggers with Undying and comes back as a 4/3. Let's see what Garrett's got now. Looks like he's drawn a lot of lands this game. I don't know exactly what 5 drops Garrett's playing. I did talk with him a little bit about the deck earlier today. Oh, and here we see a Birthing Pod. He's going to pay for it. The Heart, he's going to pay for it with Phyrexian Mana, drop him to 19. Going to sack out his Gravecrawler. Go get a 2-drop. At this point, I guess the 2-drop of choice would be Blood Artist, which makes it very difficult for Troy to win through the combat step. We know Troy is obviously playing a full play set of Path to Exile, but it's already used one, and there's plenty of targets for him to use otherwise. There, in fact, is a Blood Artist. Obviously, in any pod deck, Garrett's going to be able to play a lot of Silver Bullets, so I think that's the only Blood Artist in his deck. I know he plays a 1 Thragtusk on 5. He plays an Acidic Slime as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, his high end is at 6 for Mikaeus the Unhallowed. So Troy taps out for a Wiltleaf Liege, which might turn out to be too little too late here, as Garrett basically has unlimited access to his deck here with a 3, a 2, and a 1 that he can pot away. I'm not sure he really wants to do any of that at this point. So Garrett adds another copy of Blood Artist to his board, having drawn it naturally here. So he's playing more copies. There is Lockdown Smiter for the 2-card combo of Liege plus a Giant Smiter, so a 6/6 for 3 mana. And Troy tries to find some blocks here that'll be profitable and help him get out of the situation. Of course, Garrett with an active Birthing Pod after this, as well as the ability to eat a Path to Exile with his Deathrite Shaman. This should be lethal here. Still pretty brutal. Hopefully we can get that on tonight. Or at least do some in-between play testing so you can see what that deck looks like. So Troy going to start talking himself likely for a Dryad Mill. Nope, an Aether Vial. So the best possible start from Troy. Did Garrett even draw a card? I didn't see him draw. That doesn't mean he didn't. I often wonder how people forget to draw their cards, which is actually a pretty common mistake that you see people make, because drawing cards is the most fun part of Magic. So Troy follows it up with a turn 2 Noble Hierarch. He's going to shock himself again. Why? He's going to debate shocking himself again. I guess if he wants to leave Path to Exile up here, Gravecrawler is definitely the kind of card that you'd be willing to path, and decides not to. So with a Aether Vial on 1, I think Troy's only relevant cards are Dryad Militant, and he might be playing some number of Judges Familiar along with the Noble Hierarch, obviously. So Garrett fetches him up an Overgrown Tomb, So he can play a Blood Artist. So again, the more cards we see out of Garrett's deck, the more it looks like a Scars of Mirrodin block standard deck. But you can argue with the synergies of these cards, backed up with the power of Birthing Pod to go get whatever bullet you need at the time. So Troy untaps, sticks his Vial up to 2. Obviously debating what to do here. There's a Rest in Peace. Obviously out of the sideboard. Very good in this matchup, as Troy's deck does not interact with his graveyard at all. Meanwhile, Garrett's entire deck nearly does. So for those of you just joining us, we've got Garrett, who's one of our regulars. He normally plays Kiki Jiki Pod, but tonight he's serving up a home excuse me, serving up a fun homebrew, a Golgari Birthing Pod deck with a lot of zombies in it. So Path takes out the Gravecrawler, and then obviously Rest in Peace shutting down Blood Artist triggered, though the Path would have shut it down anyway, exiling the creature. So there's the best time to play Razorverse, sticking on turn 3, getting it in just before the Rules Clause takes effect. So we're going to tap out here for a Smiter, debating the Aven Rift Watcher, probably, or Aven Mind Sensor, I should say. There's a very good card against Garrett. That being a Mirror Crusader. Not sure if Troy plays those in the main, or if he plays those in the sideboard. Going to Abrupt Decay the Rest in Peace. Chat mentioning that earlier as a possibility. Obviously, that is what happens there. But Garrett's still going to have a hard time racing this Mirror Crusader. Obviously, he is capable of doing that, but not after Troy plays his second Path to Exile here. Neutralizing the Geralf's Messenger. And helping, more importantly, taking out the backside of that card as well. Wiltleaf Liege is going to increase this clock tremendously, as we now have a 3/3 Mirror Crusader, which is going to get in for 6 damage here. Well, it's going to be 8 damage because of the Exalted trigger. Garrett being kind enough to point that out to him. So Troy in a pretty good spot here with a 3/3 creature that none of the cards in Garrett's deck can interact with. So remember, Garrett just put this deck together today, so obviously not metagaming against the likely sideboard tech out of the Hate Bears deck in Mirror Crusader. I know the Legacy version of Death and Taxes plays a couple Mirror Crusaders main, or at least versions do, so I'm not sure if Troy has that in his main deck or not, though it's actually pretty good against most of the metagame, as you cannot terminate it, you can't block it with a variety of creatures, you can't ping it with Olivia, and so on and so forth. But definitely coming out of the sideboard at a minimum, and putting Garrett in a pretty interesting spot here. Not sure if he's playing Damnation or some other kind of Edict effect. Skinrender can't do anything to it, but it can put the Wiltleaf Liege down to nearly dead. So we're going to eat another 8 here from the Mirror Crusader. I guess Troy is a Wiltleaf Liege away from winning this. Any equipment, if you'd sideboarded in any swords, like the Hate Bears decks normally do. Have a copy of Feast and Famine or Fire and Ice in their boards. But no, Troy's not going to add anything to his boards. He's going to make Garrett deal with the situation as it stands. So Garrett's going to draw a card. Don't know what his outs could be at this spot. He's going to think about it, but I think he's likely dead here. Going to need to gain at least 8 life to stay relevant. Going to serve in with the Blood Artist. Troy probably just going to take 3. And then that should be enough. Nope, there's a... Garrett's card is the least relevant here, because he's not one to showboat. Nope, I guess it's not. So I guess there was a potential for Garrett to gain some life there, but not nearly enough life to overcome the 4/4 double striking Mirror Crusader. So let's see if Garrett goes back to his sideboard, sees if he can come up with an answer, or he's just going to play the hope you don't draw it, hope I can outrace it plan. As Mirror Crusader's a heck of a card. Looks like he's keeping this. So we move into game 3 here. With Garrett on the play, he leads off with a Marsh Flats, going to sack that, go get an Overgrown Tomb at instep. More importantly, Troy, no 1-drop, so no Aether Vial, no Dryad Militant, no Noble Hierarch to help him ramp out into a turn 2 Mirror Crusader, which is probably the best thing that Troy could do in this spot. Troy trying to get his money's worth on cuts here. So Garrett untaps. Just passes back, so Garrett's deck definitely has some very aggressive draws with Gravecrawlers, with Diregraf Ghouls, with Blood Artists, but this is not one of them. But Troy, again, with no 2-drop this time, so we haven't seen a Thalia this entire game, or this entire match, which is likely at the 2 spots most games that this deck plays, as Garrett fetches up another Overgrown Tomb end of turn. Garrett just passing back, so not a lot of action here. No Gravecrawlers, no Blood Artists, no Geralf's Messengers here. And there's a Mirror Crusader. So let's see if Garrett has some kind of edict effect here. He's going to fetch up his 3rd Overgrown Tomb. But that Mirror Crusader by itself representing nearly a 4-turn clock. Garrett does have obviously some life gain, and he can race this situation, but he's going to be up against it here, falling well behind. With that fetch land, it is now 4-turn clock whenever Garrett cracks it. Question, is there any Lilianas in the zombie deck? That's a very good point. Garrett has Lilianas, so it's not unlikely that there are some in there, but I cannot confirm, and I do not know how many there are if they are in his deck. And there is a Phyrexian Revoker naming Deathrite Shaman. So let's see if Garrett's cracking this fetch land in response. As said, the cracking that fetch going down to 12, very relevant as it now shortens his clock by a turn. So Garrett's he's assembled the news team here with all of his Overgrown Tombs. Now let's see what the other cards in his deck do. He's got a handful of cards. He certainly has some kind of business here. There's a Skinrender, which is going to nuke the Phyrexian Revoker. So that'll free up his Deathrite Shaman, to at least let him gain 2 life at the end of turn here. There is a path on the Skinrender, which will help Garrett, if nothing else, thin his deck out of what seems to be like every land that he's drawn. So there's a Wiltleaf Liege. It makes a 3/3 Mirror Crusader, serves in for 6, and now it's back down to a turn clock. I'm assuming Garrett's going to end of turn gain 2 life, but eating the Revoker go back up to 8. Not sure it's going to matter too much though. Garrett really looking for some answers here. Wiltleaf Liege tough for him to deal with. You can't Abrupt Decay it. The way you beat this draw is to be faster than it. And Garrett not playing anything until his turn 4. Can't imagine what cards are in his hand at this point. Looks like he has drawn a lot of lands. There's a Massacre Wurm, which unfortunately will not clear the board at this point because of the Wiltleaf Liege. Massacre Wurm is the another high end of Garrett's pod chain, which is actually pretty brutal if he can get into it against Troy's deck. But the Wiltleaf Liege complicates things, as it's a 3/3 and he won't be able to get rid of the Mirren Crusader, but he's going to play it anyway. The chat now offering up a variety of potential answers at this point. Damnation, Death Clouds, Mutilate, all of these things would be good. And the Massacre Wurm would have looked really good if Troy hadn't played the Wiltleaf Liege, or if Garrett had an answer to that. I guess Dismember into Massacre Wurm would have looked really good there. But unfortunately, that's not the case. We're going to serve in with the Pro Black and Pro Green Mirren Crusader. It's going to drop Garrett down to 2. So effectively dead on board next turn. And then Troy's going to follow up with a Scavenging Ooze of his own, as well as a Rest in Peace. I know he has, you can see the Rest in Peace in his hand, whether or not he wants to cast it here. I think he has 2 copies of Rest in Peace, to be perfectly honest with you. Nope, just going to play another attacker here, so just forcing Garrett to have some answers here. I think he drew a Mortar Pod, which is one way of dealing with the Crusader. Well, how's Mortar Pod worded? Does Mortar Pod do the damage, or does the creature? I think the creature does. So that might not be any good either. It's obviously not good in this situation, regardless, as the cards Garrett wants to hook up with Mortar Pod. Yep, so Mortar Pod does read the creature does the damage. So we can't sack 2 creatures with Mortar Pod to kill the Crusader. Not sure you can do much of anything here, period. Only 1 card left in Garrett's hand. I think it is the Mortar Pod. Garrett looking for a way out of this mess. I don't think there is one. He's going to need to gain at least 5 life here. So Garrett's draw pretty awkward here, as he's drawn, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lands, one of those coming off a Path to Exile. So drew 4 fetch lands and still drew 7 lands total. We know he has very aggressive starts capable, but he didn't see any of his 1-drops, none of his 2-drops, after mulling to 6 on the play here. So 1 Wiltleaf Liege away from a Massacre Wurm being your highlight of the week, but as it stands, looks like Garrett's going to drop this one. There's a Mortar Pod, which is, I'm sure, a sideboard card. You often see it in Legacy Elves as a way of dealing with nuisance creatures, but not going to be enough here. Yeah, and to answer questions in the chat, this is a homebrew that Garrett's trying out tonight. He normally plays Angel Pod, which is very much a tier 1 deck, but decided to try something new. This has not been tuned in any fashion. I think this is basically the rough draft that Garrett threw together today. I don't think he's looking to run the Grand Prix circuit with it anytime soon, as we see the handshake, Garrett realizing he cannot come up with enough. And so relatively poor draw to Garrett's deck, and the always tough to deal with Mirren Crusader, proving very decisive in this match. Garrett got game 1 pretty handily, and then basically Mirren Crusader on its own winning games 2 and 3 for Troy. So Garrett goes back to the drawing board, sees if he wants to play this in the future, he'll need to come up with an answer to Mirren Crusader. Again, Hate Bear is not necessarily the most popular tier 1 deck, but it is very tier 1. So it's something you'll want to be aware of. Question in the chat, is Pod referring to Mortar Pod or Birthing Pod? It's a Birthing Pod deck. potting away Geralf's Messenger into Skinrender, and then potting that away into Massacre Wurm feels very good. So that was the angle that Garrett was shooting for. Didn't work out for him, but hey, there is you can't play new decks unless somebody innovates. So Garrett having some